Thank you very much for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to see you all here on this rainy, somewhat cold evening. Um, so I work for Cascadia Research Collective, and tonight I hope to impart some information onto you about entanglements of large whales, and then also what we're doing not only to help individuals, but what research we're doing to prevent these in the future. And before I begin, I just want to say that all of these activities are done by authorized responders. And so we work under authorization from NOAA or National Marine Fisheries. And so all the images and video are taken under permit. They're all listed at the bottom here, unless authorized, otherwise stated in the presentation. But if you're unfamiliar with Cascadia, we're a nonprofit based right here in downtown Olympia, and we've been around since the 70s. So we're not new to the area. If you don't know us, we've been here and been doing a lot of research, not just in Washington, but also in Hawaii, Oregon, and California. So I won't be touching on the Hawaii research. We do have some folks you can tap about that are here tonight. But most of the entanglement response that I'm talking about is occurring in Washington, Oregon, and California. So the basis of our work at Cascadia is really photo ID, and that's knowing an individual and being able to recognize it each time you see it. And so that goes into our long-term population data. And we can look at minimum numbers in the population, what their abundance and what their population trends are. And this is all to basically discover or to track the recovery of species like humpback whales, blue whales, and gray whales that are all still recovering from the era of whaling. With that data, we can also learn about movements, not only along the US West Coast and these animals' feeding grounds, but also between the US West Coast and different breeding grounds. So most of these species head off to other waters to breed. And not only with photo ID, but also by tagging these individuals or putting little trackers on them, we can really learn about their fine scale movements as well as their longer migration movements. And this also plays into entanglement response, which I'll be focusing on tonight. But knowing the individual really allows us to gather a lot of information, not only about where that whale tends to live, where it might have picked up that gear, how long it was entangled, and then also if it survived that entanglement. So I'm not alone at Cascadia. We do have a response team, and most of our team are also folks that work out on the water collecting the long-term population data. And so Doug and I are level 5 responders, which is the sort of the highest authorization you can get under NOAA. Once again, we work under that authorization to make sure that the teams are trained up and also follow the same safety protocols, also collecting the same type of data so that we can really work towards prevention. Other team members, John is a level 4, and the only difference there is we can all, or the 3 of us can lead entanglement responses, but Doug and I both worked on the East Coast, so we have a lot of experience with North Atlantic right whales, which are an extremely endangered species, and they're sort of like a different beast. They're quite large and quite strong, and so you need to make sure you've had experience with that to be able to lead those entanglements. But we also have 2 level 3 responders, Jack and James, and they are both based down in California, but they work all up and down the US West Coast as well. And then Alex, Andy, and Hannah are all newer to the team, not necessarily newer to Cascadia, but some of our newer team members that are getting trained up so that they become level 3 responders. And level 3 responders are authorized to basically put a tracking buoy on the entangled whale until a level 4 or 5 can arrive on scene. And Cascadia is not the only organization that does this work. We work in a whole community. So these are just a few examples of our network partners that also respond along the US West Coast, those that contribute data to trying to solve the entanglement problem, as well as some of our funders. But it really is a whole community working towards a solution. As I said, we're authorized under NOAA, and we're not just the only ones on the US West Coast. We're part of a national network. And so whether you go to Hawaii, Alaska, the East Coast, or the West Coast, we all follow the same protocols and the same methodologies that basically we're standing on the shoulders of giants. This isn't a new problem. It's not unique to Washington. And so we've learned from past mistakes of other responders and built on those skills and tools that they started using back in the 70s. We're also part of the North American network. And so we do, especially on this coastline, work very closely with the team up in Canada, as well as those in Mexico. And so we coordinate with them to let them know when we didn't get the job done and one of our whales is headed their way, and they let us know when the same happens, or if they happen to find a whale with US gear, they provide that information to us. Oh no. And then we're part of the global whale entanglement response network. And then this is under the IWC, or the International Whaling Commission. And basically it's a way for different nations to come together to try and solve this problem. Once again, really anywhere there are whales, there is usually an entanglement issue, because where whales are feeding, usually that's an area that we are also using for fishing. And so these are just some examples of the teams all around the countries that are also using the same methodologies I'll be talking about today, and that we coordinate with and share ideas with, as well as work on new tools and different techniques to solve this problem. For the most part, I'll be talking about large baleen whales. So on this coastline, these are the common species. My focus will mostly be on humpback whales. They're just sort of on the spotlight because they are the ones that are reported most often entangled, and that's also because they tend to spend a lot of time in areas with whale watching communities that are really out there all the time watching them. Blue and fin whales also get entangled, but they're just not as seen as often, but they do have the scars from entanglements, and we do get reports. And then gray whales is another common species for us to get entanglement reports. So if you're new to the entanglement issue, the reason why it is such a big issue is because it's one of the largest causes of death to these whales because of us. And that means that's something we can work towards reducing. And these entanglements can cause immediate drowning, so the whale might not be able to make it back up to the surface to even breathe. It can cause long-term starvation if they can't even open their mouths to feed. Chronic drag is basically, if you think of a ball and chain as you're walking around, the amount of energy you have to exert just to move, even if you can feed, your two levels don't, match. And so you just can't eat enough food to match your energetic needs. And then there's also, chronic infection and trauma that can lead to death and mortality. But not all entanglements lead to mortality. Some of the less complex times, whales can get out of gear themselves, or if we can remove the gear from the whale, then those whales can survive as well, as long as the injuries aren't too severe. So there's sort of two lenses that we can view through for entanglements, and that's sort of an animal welfare lens where you really want to help that individual. This is an example of a very common type of entanglement configuration around the fluke blades that basically becomes a tourniquet, cutting off circulation, and then the flukes become necrotic and can eventually fall off. The last images of a whale that was seen last year here in Washington in the inland waters in Puget Sound. And so even though that whale was swimming around, the chances of it being able to migrate and really feed and sort of thrive are very unlikely. And so these entanglements can last, a couple of days, a few months, and we've actually had at least one humpback whale that's lasted over a year entangled. Beyond the animal welfare, beyond the individual, it can affect the population as well. So as a conservation issue, even those that survive their entanglements, some studies have found that females have lower birthing rates, or calves have a reduced growth rate, or females start to have their first calf at a later age. And when it's baleen whales, basically they have to reach a certain body size or health size before they can successfully start to have calves of their own. So if they suffer one or two entanglements while they're younger, then that might prevent them from reaching that size for a few more years. So as you can imagine, even these whales that are surviving can have an effect on the population recovery and growth. So those are sort of the two lenses that we can view this issue. So the reasons behind entanglement response, one is to try and help that individual. We want to relieve the suffering if we can, even if we remove all the gear and the whale is unlikely to survive. That could still help that individual, and a lot of them do survive once we remove the gear. And as I said, the conservation issue for a lot of populations that are really endangered, like the North Atlantic right whales or the southern killer whales, one loss of one individual due to entanglements can really have sort of a cascade effect on that population. And then if there aren't trained responders, then I know for certain the public would take it into their own hands to try and help these whales. And we do have folks that sort of go out and do ad hoc responses, but that can really be dangerous for the people involved. As you can see, this gentleman jumped on this whale's back. The whales are huge. I've never had a whale think that I'm helping it. I've worked on over or close to 100 whales so far in my career. I've been doing this about 15 years. And they are wild animals that are in pain. And if you think of a huge whale, that's a 15-foot, arm that even if it's just trying to move it, not aggressively or for harm, if you get hit with that, that's going to do a lot of damage. Also, with these ad hoc responses, unfortunately, a lot of people just cut the gear that they see or that are easiest to grab, but that's not really what's going to end up killing the whale. So the life-threatening gear that's, cutting off blood supply or preventing the whale from feeding is usually left on the whale. And so that really hinders our ability. We won't have access to this individual. We won't know that it needs help. And then folks cutting away sort of the less life-threatening gear, preventing us from getting access, unfortunately does not help the whale in the long term. With that said, our responses are also working towards prevention, and that's really the most important thing. Even those that we can get our hands on won't necessarily survive, and so we really want to prevent the next entanglement from even happening. And so our main goals of prevention is really to prevent the co-occurrence of whales and fishing gear, to reduce the chances of a whale interacting with that gear by modifying that gear, and then reducing the impact of entanglements, sort of the severity of the injuries, or lessening that impact by modifying the gear. But in order to do that, we need information. We can't just go out there and be like, get it done. If we don't know who's getting entangled, where they're getting entangled, when they're getting entangled, or what they're getting entangled in, then we can't even start, or don't even know where to start, preventing that from occurring. And that type of information is what we're getting during these responses. So not only are we helping that individual, but we're basically have our hands on that information so that we can work towards methods of prevention. And then once the government or the state agencies implement different modifications or management strategies, then we need to continue these responses to validate, to see if those mitigation efforts actually had the results that they wanted. So I'm going to jump into a quick rundown of sort of what's involved in a response. And before I jump into that, just the priorities are human safety, whale safety, and then documentation and data collection. So if any of us get hurt, or if we lose our life doing this, then the government will shut down all responses. And so then, unfortunately, a lot of whales will go down without being able to be helped. And we use the best protocols we can from lessons learned over the past decades to prevent any injuries or harm to the responders. But we did lose a Canadian colleague just a few years ago, and it shut down the network in the US and Canada. And so we had lessons learned, we changed some of our methods, and then we can go forward, hopefully in a safer environment. Also, our methods that we use, whales are huge and they are very strong, but they are just an animal. They are just skin and bones and muscle and fat. And so we can easily damage them, especially if we use like heavy machinery or start to think of them more or less of an animal and just as a huge object. And so the methods we use really take that into consideration to make sure we're not harming the animal in the process of trying to save it. So with that said, some of our techniques were based on whaling methods. So if you think of some images that you've probably seen of a harpoon going into the whale and then a line with a bunch of buoys, and that's how they track the whale after they've struck it. We've modified that. And when a whale is entangled, a lot of times they'll have gear coming off of them. So we use a grapple hook that we have an example on the table you can check out afterwards. And we throw that into the trailing gear and it grabs hold of the gear. And now we have a leash and a buoy attached. And so now we have about 60 more feet behind the whale with a buoy. So when the whale goes down on a dive, that buoy will stay at the surface longer. We can track the whale, and when it comes back up, that buoy will come to the surface before the whale does. And so we can track it a little easier. With that, I don't know if any of you have dogs, but as you can imagine, it's a lot easier to catch a dog if it has a 30-foot leash rather than a 6-foot leash on it. So once we can establish that control line, as we call it, we do all this from a very small inflatable boat. We basically turn off the engines and then start pulling ourselves up closer to the whale. And while we do that, we use very large Norwegian buoys, or they're buoys, some folks call them Norwegian buoys, but these large floats that we move closer and closer to the whale. And that sort of tires out the whale. I don't know how strong you are, but I've never met anyone that was strong enough just to hold on to a whale and slow them down. And so basically, we let them go as they can, and we try and slow them down by adding those floats or adding that drag. And also, as we move it closer to the whale, it prevents them from going down on a dive. In addition to, you're trying to catch your dog, it's almost as if your dog could fly. So it's that 3-dimension that once the whales go under the surface, we can't touch them. And so we really need them to stay at the surface. So by moving the flotations closer, that keeps them at the surface longer. We do all of our work from a small inflatable or from a boat. We never get in the water with the whale. Once again, they're very strong. Unfortunately, a gentleman from New Zealand was killed when he got in the water trying to free a whale. So not only is the whale big, but it also has netting and line around it. And a whale can hold its breath a lot longer than I can hold mine. And so we do all of our work from our boat. We're very good at the techniques we use with that. To be able to figure out the configuration, we might stick our heads in the water to get a view to see how it's entangled around the whale, but we can also use long poles with GoPros on them and really document exactly how that gear is on the whale. Not only does that inform things later on to figure out how the whale interacted with the gear, but it lets us come up with a game plan. So we can see exactly what lines need to be cut and in what order to make sure that we're not cutting ourselves off of the control line before we've actually removed what's going to kill the whale. So once we come up with a game plan, we have specialized tools. Most of them we can use on very long poles, so we can stay behind the whale, which is the safest area to be. Once again, in that small inflatable, and we're just holding onto that line. Our engine is up so that it won't get entangled in the trailing gear, and also the prop wouldn't have any possibility of hitting the whale while we're working. And then we have a bunch of different types of knives that we can use, but for the most basic type, they're hooked knives with a little safety tip on them so that we can place them forward and pull them back. And so they can actually hook that line, but then that safety tip prevents the knife from actually cutting into the whale. And so we can reach forward on the whale when the line's on the back, but in a lot of cases, an animal will be sort of anchored in one spot with weighted gear. So we can use those long poles to go deeper in the water column and make those cuts further, 15 or 20 feet beneath the surface. So now that you have an idea of the process, I'm going to show you a quick video, because we don't have a ton of time tonight, about one of the whales, Starry Night, that we disentangled up here in Washington this summer. This is only a 1-year-old, which we'll get into in a second, but you can see it's actually using its pectoral fins to swim. And that's because it can't really use its flukes right now, as it has a lot of line coming off of them. The team had previously put a telemetry buoy on that whale so we could track it overnight. That's our inflatable. You can see the person in the bow just pulling up on that trailing gear. That's another boat. Yeah, that's a good question. So in this instance, you can see them pulling up, and they'll be sort of moving those kegging buoys closer and closer. And I think this event took about 2 hours, and so I can't show you the whole video. So we're going to cut to the cutting portion. But as they move up, they would move those buoys up. They'd use a long pole with a GoPro to get the documentation, and then come up with this game plan. And this whale required 3 cuts. 1 line across its peduncle or tailstock, and then 1 cut on either fluke blade. So that's the second cut, and this is the third cut. And you can see that hooked knife. And that was the second cut. And then they're just making sure there's nothing underneath. But just as they're doing that, you'll see the line work its way free of that wound. And then about a week later, the whale watching community was able to document Starry Night and document that it was completely gear free, and then also those wounds. And so that we could then document how those wounds are healing. You could see they're quite severe. To answer your question about the drone, so with these responses, we have that small inflatable. It's actually like the Navy SEAL boats that you're supposed to be able to drop from the air and they inflate. Well, these are old school ones that probably aren't very perfect, but we, in this response, had two other boats. One RIB, a team from Cascadia was coming from Port Townsend, and then a team from the San Juans was coming on a larger boat. The Morning Star, and the Morning Star was able to transport that small inflatable on their boat. So the Morning Star flew a drone to be able to basically beforehand see if there was any gear forward on the animal, so that when we could put the GoPro in the back, we could verify what the entanglement was like. And then the boat from Cascadia basically had all the tools. So we want to keep that little inflatable as clean as possible. So every step you do, you get the equipment you need for that one step and then go back and get the next. So there aren't knives and a whole bunch of things just lying around in that little boat. So, yeah.
Is that white line on one side of the flukes, is that the cut from the rope?
The scar, yeah, yep. So this is an example of the grapple that, once again, you can take a look at later. So with Starry Night, you know, it's only 1 year old. We disentangled it in July, and then in August it got entangled again. And so this is just to show some of the process, but the San Juan team, those are folks from CDOC Society and the Whale Museum practicing this. But you throw a grapple, you can see the grapple catching onto the trailing line. And then that's the telemetry buoy that's also here you can take a look at. And that buoy will have a tag in it so that we can actually track the whale overnight. So when the first time around when Starry Night got entangled, and the second time around, the team from the Whale Museum and the San Juans went out. They have a level 3 responder, so they were able to put a tag on Starry Night. And then our team was able to track the whale overnight, meet the San Juan team, and finish the entanglement the next day. And this is what it looks like with the whale and then the telemetry buoy, and you can see the little antenna. With that Starry Night, this was the first response that you just saw. They put the tag on near the San Juans, and Starry Night made it almost to Port Angeles by the next morning. And so we were originally going to go to Anacortes, but luckily we saw her track overnight and instead went out of Port Townsend. The month later, when she got in, or I think it's a he, we're not quite sure. When Starry Night got entangled again, once again, the team went out and put a telemetry buoy on. We tracked overnight, and this time it went north rather than south. And so we were able to disentangle it right before it crossed into the Canadian, or across the Canadian border. And that, yeah.
So for your bus drive to the location and launch time?
Yeah, at Cascadia, we have a few different ribs, and we trailer it all up and down the West Coast. And so it makes responses great because we also respond to Northern California and Oregon, bringing our own gear. For California, we tend to fly down because we do have a boat, a Cascadia team and boat down in Monterey as well. So this is Starry Night during the second entanglement, and this is documentation taken underneath, and you can see the white lines, and it was really hard for the team even looking, being like, what is scars from the last entanglement and what is actually line from this entanglement. So those are the sort of the 3 line, or the types of lines that we were questioning at that time. And all of those yellow ones and on the whale's back, those are all scars from its first entanglement. So we had to verify that there was actually no gear there. That was actually just from the first one. And then there was very thin line. It was very embedded, so it made it very difficult to cut. But those were the 2 cuts from the current entanglement that the team needed to remove or break for that gear to come off. And once again, they did. And once again, a week later, the whale watching community was able to document Starry Night, and you can see it breaching, lobtailing, but you can see all the wounds and the markings left by its 2 entanglements this year. So that's an example of a response. And so now I'm going to talk about the data that we collected during a response and every response like that, so that we are working towards prevention. So number one, who is getting entangled and are they surviving their entanglement? So as I mentioned, Starry Night was the whale that we worked on twice up here in Washington. We knew it was a year old because we saw it as a calf, and we're able to know that through photo ID. As I said, that's sort of the basis of Cascadia's work. And for humpback whales, their flukes can range from all white to all black, everything in between. And then they have marks like barnacle scars or rake marks from where orcas have tried to attack them. They can also have ship strike scars as well as entanglement scars throughout their lives. And so we can document those, know what they've gotten into, and also track them throughout their life. So when Starry Night was seen as a calf, it was with its mom, Fallen Night, who we started watching back in 2003. And especially up here in the Salish Sea, there are a lot of research organizations and catalogs that are collecting information at this scale. So we know a female and we know her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother. We can make these maternal lineages and really understand reproductive rates and areas for the Salish Sea that basically were wiped out during whaling. It took about 100 years before humpback started showing up again. And so this is quite fantastic that we've been able to see it basically spawn from just a few whales and grow to what it is today. There's another website you can check out, Happy Whale, and that's basically a collaborative effort. All of our organizations, Cascadia does sort of the US West Coast, some of those groups that I just mentioned does like British Columbia, and then we have colleagues all around that contributed to help AI basically match these whales for us. And it's also an avenue for citizen scientists to donate data to it. So with Fallen Night, we know that she spends a lot of time in Washington, but she breeds in Hawaii. So even though we haven't seen Starry Night in Hawaii, we know it will also go to Hawaii because that's where it was born. And there's maternal lineage or maternal site fidelity. So wherever a calf was born and wherever its mom brought it during its first summer is where it will return. And this is important because management or the government manages humpback whales through their breeding stocks with the idea is if you were to wipe out all the whales that breed in Hawaii, then it would take a super long time before that group of whales starts to really recover. And you would lose basically any culture, anything like that that came from that population. Hawaii and Mexico are recovering from whaling. The Central American population is still considered endangered. So it's a smaller population. And so things like entanglement and ship strike can have a much greater effect on that population than it can in Hawaii or Mexico or for those populations. And so it's really important for us to be able to figure out who the individuals are and know what breeding ground they go to. So this is just an example of five other whales this summer that were entangled. And with Starry Night and Chex Mix was just a calf, and so we hadn't seen it on a breeding ground yet. But we could use check marks, which is its mom's information, and we could tell that 2 of them were from the Hawaiian population, 2 of them were from the Mexican population, and 1 of them was from the Central American population. So this all feeds into management and understanding what effect entanglements are having on these different subgroups. We can also take that information of the individual and know if it was seen after its report, if it was seen gear-free after its report, and then what we really care about is seeing it the next season to make sure it made it through migration. They don't feed while they're down in the breeding grounds, and so basically we think if they can make it back up here after 1 breeding cycle, that they were able to successfully survive that entanglement. So looking at survival, we can then move on to how many whales actually get entangled. And this is the number of reports along the US West Coast since they first started collecting data was basically back in the 80s. However, there really wasn't a network till the early 2000s, and it really wasn't until 2014 that they really systematically started to collect data on this. And so that's sort of when this really becomes understood as a problem. And you can see in 2014 on, there are a lot of humpback whales. They're the ones in red, but you can see basically all large whale species are affected by entanglement. However, that's just the number of reports, and reports doesn't equal the number of entanglement cases. A single entangled whale can be reported multiple times throughout its entanglement duration. And so NOAA goes through to match every report to each other by the ID of the whale and the gear type to make sure that they're not double counting those. But at the same time, entanglement cases doesn't equal the total amount of whales that are becoming entangled. Those are just the number of whales that are actually reported to authorities. So we can use things like entanglement scars to actually understand how big the problem is. So not all whales that are seen entangled, and we know that based on their scars. We use their tail stalk, which is an area that are less likely to get scars from any other interaction, either with themselves or boat strikes or anything like that. So you can see this entanglement on the right-hand side might leave sort of that bottom scarring, that sort of really deeply embedded line can leave a really significant scar on the whale's tail. But even if we don't see the whale with gear on it, we'll know that it was entangled at least once in its life. So we can start to get an understanding along the entire US West Coast how many whales have actually interacted with gear in their life. And depending on the region, it ranges from about 1/4 to at least 40% of whales have been entangled at least once in their life. And what we're really interested in now is really the accumulation rate. So not just have you ever been entangled, but have you been entangled this year or since the last time we saw you, so that now we can really keep track of any mitigation efforts that are put into effect. Is that bringing that scarring rate down? Just because with reporting rate, that is quite biased. The more people we talk to and inform about the problem, that when you're on the water, you're more likely to make a report. So the number of reports can go up, but that doesn't necessarily mean more whales are becoming entangled. It just means we're reporting a higher percentage of the entanglements. So for entanglement reports, this came out from NOAA last year. This is nationwide. So across the whole US, 95 large whales were confirmed entangled, and 77 of those were humpback whales. So once again, those are just the number of reports. So if we say, let's say 1 in 5 whales gets reported entangled, then that means over 300 last year alone were never seen entangled, whether they survived it or not. And then if you increase that to 1 in 10 whales were actually reported, then all of a sudden that's suggesting closer to 700 whales got entangled last year. Now, there was a study down on the East Coast, which is a really well-studied population, sort of like the Salish Sea here. And they have a response team that's actually paid to be on call all the time. That was where I used to work, so I'm well aware of that. You had to be on the boat in 30 minutes every day if a call came in. None of us on this coastline, there's no paid team to be on call all the time. There's no funding for that. So on that coastline, there's only about a 7% reporting rate. And that's a really well-established network. So that means 1 in about 16 whales are reported each year, which when you look at last year alone, that would suggest that over 1,000 whales were entangled and were not reported last year. And that is a huge number and really hard for me to comprehend. But even so, this suggests that we really need to do that scar study on this coastline, which we are attempting to do, to get a handle on, is it more like 300 or is it more like 1,000 whales are going unseen each year entangled? So what are whales actually becoming entangled in? I have to go quicker. We can answer, I can hang around a little later to answer questions, but I'm going to go over, sorry. So a lot of it is fishing gear, and that's just because there's a lot of gear in the water, and there's a lot of line. But we have whales that are entangled in sea cables. This is an example, once again, from the East Coast. It's from a whale watching boat that they basically saw a whale get entangled in an anchor line. So they were a boat fishing for tuna, and they use an anchor line. And this is a good example, not only of different types of gear whales can get entangled in, but their reaction to it. So when all of a sudden you see a whale all wrapped in line, this is how they react. And so it's really easy to understand how all of a sudden basically they get scars and, wrapped all up in their body real quick. For the gear characteristics, unfortunately, most of the cases, especially here, well, not just here in Washington, up and down the US West Coast, more than half of them we can't identify to a specific fishery. And that's just because it's just line on the whale's tail. This is an example of a whale that was entangled for over a year. It wasn't until we went back and found a previous sighting of it that we found that it actually had a buoy attached to it at that point. And then by the time we came across it, that buoy had come off, but we couldn't tie it to a fishery. And so it's really important, and the management has really made a lot of extra effort to be able to identify fishing gear. And so with a lot of fisheries, they require marking on the buoys or special tags. They're even putting in line marking or line colors. So even if the buoy comes off, the line color, we would be able to identify a specific fishery. At the same time, if the line isn't that color, then we'd be able to exclude that fishery as a cause. So it's really good to be able to narrow down what these whales are interacting and becoming entangled in. We also want to know where in the water column the whales are interacting so we can understand where the gear needs to be modified. So this is a case where there was a coil of line that was about 30 feet down in the water column. That was probably the catch point for the whale. So if that coil didn't exist, then the whale probably wouldn't have become entangled and the line could have just slipped off. And so information like this helps inform management and the fisheries as to how they can change their gear to make it a little whale safe. When are whales becoming entangled? Most people think it's marine debris or ghost gear, but that's usually not the fact, actually. Previous studies have found that it's mostly active fishing gear when it is fishing gear involved. And based on a study that we'll be publishing hopefully next year, this is just fixed trap fishery, and it's only gear that had enough identifying characteristics that we could talk to the fisherman and know where and when he sent the gear. But most of those reports actually occurred within the fishing season. So we know that it was quote unquote active fishing gear because the report didn't come after the season was closed. And based on the whales that we could identify, none of them had sightings when the report came in after the season that showed that they were gear free. And then they became entangled afterwards. So it is a mix of probably some lost gear, even lost gear during the fishing season. So we really need to come up with methods to reduce that knowledge gap. And where are whales becoming entangled? This just shows the reports along the US West Coast through 2024. You can see all the different species, but report location doesn't necessarily mean that's where the whale gear conflict is. Most reports occur in areas with high whale watching effort or a lot of mariners on the water that are actually looking at these whales, and less likely, on the outer coast of Washington or Oregon where there's just fewer people out there. This is just a zoomed in view. You can see it's a diverse species, and there are quite a few in the inside waters of Washington. This is once a paper that we're hoping to publish next year, but it shows the dots are where the gear was set, and the arrow points to where the whale was actually first seen entangled. So the Washington gear is orange, and you can see there are some cases the whale got entangled in Washington gear and then wasn't reported until they made it all the way down to Mexico. And which is amazing to me that they were able to, make the whole coastline and no one saw them. And this is just based on gear that, once again, we could identify to be able to talk to the fishermen and know where and when they set it. So what are we doing with this information, and what is Cascadia doing? One of the things is the Partnership for the West Coast Whale, Partnership for West Coast Whale Entanglement Action that Doug and I are co-directing, and really we're trying to increase the ability for teams along the entire West Coast to respond. So there aren't that many level 4 or 5s, and so we're working with those local teams to increase their experience and their skill sets to advance those local teams to improve responses. We're making sure that all the teams are collecting the same data in a systematic way. So not only can we compare it through Washington, Oregon, and California, but we can also compare it to Alaska, Hawaii, Mexico, South Africa, Australia, just making sure it's all the same throughout that global whale entanglement response network. And then also training. So we're training a bunch of folks in different states to really try and bolster these teams. Once again, I've been doing this for 15 years. I am looking to bow out. It has controlled my life for that long. And so I am really putting the effort in to make sure there's a smooth transition, and the next generation up is basically picking up exactly where I left off. What else are we doing? We are trying to reduce the co-occurrence of whales and fishing gear, and we do that through different processes, such as working with CDF&W down in California to do surveys in the spring and fall to help inform them how many whales are around. They will delay the fishery. This year it's delayed till January already, based on entanglement numbers, but they will also close the season early if more whales have come back from the breeding grounds. So that's reducing that overlap. We're also providing information such as migration timing to hopefully inform when the whales are actually likely leaving the area, or the time that the slightest chance of overlap might occur. And also looking at where the whales are and what they're feeding on. If the whales are out on the shelf edge feeding on krill, there's less likely for overlap with the fishery. However, if it's a big fish year, the whales are more likely to be inshore and will overlap with those fisheries. We put in a grant and haven't heard back. It was a federal grant to look at on-demand gear, or this is considered, most of it, some of it is ropeless, but it reduces the amount of time the line is in the water as a way to reduce entanglement risk. And we were trying to introduce this to some fishermen up here in Washington, working with smelts where their gear is completely ropeless. Then also doing gear forensic workshops to basically take the gear that we took off those whales and work with the fishermen and say, this is what we took off them. How do you think the whale interacted with this? This is our idea. How do you think it should be modified? And basically really look for industry-led gear modifications that work for the fishermen, but at the same time reduce entanglement risk. Also through those abundance population trends and identifying biologically important feeding areas, we can really see where these whales are likely to spend their time, how entanglements are affecting their recovery, and then through our standard response program to basically be able to see what other threats are occurring. Gray whales last year went through a huge unusual mortality event where they lost thousands of members of their population. Nothing to do with entanglements, but that's just another stressor that really helps inform, the extra stress that entanglement is putting on them. So what can you do to help? Support your local response team, regardless of if you're local or from, Washington or Oregon or East Coast, West Coast. There's a local team near you that would benefit from your help. So I'd recommend doing that. You can join our mailing list to stay informed and to teach others and really keep you up to date on what we're doing, what threats the whales are facing. If you're out on the water, following whale watching guidelines to prevent extra stresses on those individuals, and also supporting whale safer initiatives when you can find them. And then if you are out on the water and you do see an entangled whale, to please stand by and report it. You can either call the Coast Guard or the hotline for NOAA, but by staying with the animal at a safe distance without trying to remove any gear, that will give the whale the best chance of survival. So with that, sorry I went over a little, but I'll take your questions.
Through because I grew up, the whales are considered to be on the endangered species list. And if so, why, and what are the common factors that lead them to being on that?
Yeah, so there's the Central American population of humpbacks are on the endangered species list, and that's basically during whaling, their numbers were decimated. And for the Central American population, I'm not quite sure why they are not recovering as quickly as, let's say, the Mexican population. We're not seeing their growth rate as much. So we're trying to figure that out, why that population's struggling a little bit. And so we're collaborating a lot with organizations down there. My boss, I think, went down there a few times to the breeding grounds to really try and increase the amount of research that's happening in those different countries so we can have a better understanding of who those individuals are and where they're going and what struggles they might be facing more so than other humpback populations. But like blue whales are also endangered. So we do have a few different populations on this coast that are struggling. Yeah.
Sounds like maybe funding might be somewhat of a bottleneck for being able to expand operations? What are some like the barriers or challenges that you're experiencing with coastal funding?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, most of this work and most of Cascadia's work was basically seen as essential by the federal government. And so we've relied on federal funding for most of our existence. And with change of priorities, most of that funding has ceased. So a lot of these projects that we had planned are not getting funded. So we're pivoting and trying to do other fundraising, trying to build some relationships. But we're starting a little further back than some other nonprofits are with that. Just for the coastline itself, it is a huge challenge. So when I worked on Cape Cod, we had a team on call. There was 5 of us that every day of the week we had to be 30 minutes from the boat, which basically meant I missed, my friends' weddings and, baby showers and all those things. But the whales, most of the entanglements occurred within an hour or two of Cape Cod, and so we could make a huge impact there. When you look at the US West Coast, especially Washington and Oregon, like the coastlines are so dynamic and there's so much space between ports that there's no good location to fund one team. And so instead, you would have to fund multiple teams up and down the entire coastline, and there's just no funding, or we have not found anyone, and none of the other teams have found any funding. So with that, a lot of it is organizations like the Whale Museum, Oregon State University down in Oregon. There's a few nonprofits down in Monterey Bay and things like that. We just worked with a group down in Santa Barbara where, one is a whale watching captain, and others work for Towboat USA, and they just basically have decided that as the owner of their organization, they are going to make this a priority. And so, yeah, it's a struggle not only to try and pick where you would put teams, but the priority now is trying to bolster those teams as much as we can to train them up, because right now we're flying basically everywhere to try and fill those gaps.
I was wondering, if you just tell what your path was to becoming a level 5 entanglement founder, how typical that is, or what paths people take to that.
Yeah, so I don't think there's one typical path. I can so Doug, who I mentioned, the co-director, he's also my husband, and we have 2 very different paths. So I'll tell our different paths, but I worked at a small nonprofit in Gloucester, Massachusetts, working on whale watching boats and things like that. I did internships, got into the whale research world. I was supposed to work more in strandings, and I had to be on call for that. And I said, I don't want to be on call. And so then I took another job at the Center for Coastal Studies, and not realizing that the position that I was interviewing with, someone else sat in on an interview, and it so happened that they decided I was part of the entanglement team as well. And I didn't realize that until about a month into my new job. I had moved from not wanting to be on call to being on call. And so that was basically because of my expertise with whale behavior and being out on the water. I merged with that team and worked there for about a decade. Because they get so many calls, we'd work on probably about a dozen or so whales a year, at least, just out of Cape Cod alone. We got a ton of experience. And so I had previous research experience with right whales as well, and just working on a number of whales. And so I was able to work up that way. I think I'm one out of 2 females that are level 5. So it's not very common. It's only really necessary on the East Coast, not the West Coast, to be a level 5, just because the right whales aren't out here. For my husband, he worked a zillion jobs in avalanche and ski patrol and GIS and all sorts of things, and started to work at the Vancouver Aquarium. And there he got into the whale world. they ended up having to stand by an entangled whale, and then all of a sudden he got in there. So he came out to the Center for Coastal Studies where I was working for training. We lost an employee, and so then we hired him, and he just gained experience that way. So there's a bunch of different avenues for other responders. We have firefighters. One of our teammates at Cascadia is an Army vet. We have veterinarians. We have Navy SEALs. We have just random backgrounds that all really feed in to bringing different specialties to this field. Yeah. Yep.
Vertical bigger role tied to as part of the prevention. And I guess I gave out a couple of things. It would seem that they would not want whales to get caught in there, so they could that proves their equipment. But also wondering like what kind of policy initiatives might happen at that level.
Yeah, so with the fishing industry, yes, I have never met a fisherman who was happy that a whale carried their gear away. You know, it's a economic loss to them, and really it's a bad PR. You know, like when you have a whale show up with gear, it's not helpful to them. We have a lot of good collaborators in California. We're starting to build some in Oregon, and we partnered with some in Washington when we submitted the grant for the on-demand gear. Unfortunately, in California, there was a lawsuit against the California Department of Fish and Wildlife that they weren't doing enough to save whales. And so that lawsuit really forced a hand for the industry and for NOAA and CDF&W to make changes as quickly as possible. And so that's when they, especially with Dungeness crab, they reduced the fishing season. They reduced the amount of gear in the water at different times. With Oregon and Washington, they can sort of see that coming. And so they have also preemptively started to make changes with depth restrictions and the amount of gear on the water to try and reduce that. And I don't think there's anything necessarily that makes Dungeness crab different from other fisheries besides the fact that it's just a very large fishery. And so if you were to swim in the ocean, you're more likely to come in contact with Dungeness crab gear than other fisheries, especially in the area that like humpback whales use. They might not be as abundant in further offshore areas that other fisheries tend to use. So there is a lot of work there. We just started with, it's called a take reduction team, that basically through another lawsuit, the sablefish fishery, which is Washington, Oregon, and California, now has to reduce the amount of bycatch of large whales. And so we're part of that as well, working with fishers to basically come up with what modifications they could do to reduce the entanglement. So there's a lot going on, and the fishing industry is trying their best, and they are coming up with ideas as well. And so I would say everyone is trying to work for a common goal, but it is their livelihood at the same time. So, and I am not a fisherman, and unfortunately, a lot of things that people come up with, it's just too dangerous for them. And so it actually puts their lives at risk. If you're like, oh, you use weaker lines so whales can break it, well, that means that the gear they're hauling up can snap and, you know, kill someone. And so there is that balance of knowledge of the gear and why it is the way it is versus how we could alter it to make it whale safe. Yes.
Oh, two-part question. I'll wait. And that was about, you were up along the bay heading into towards the international border there.
Yeah.
Are you allowed to cross that for brief periods of time?
So that's a great question.
And is there someone on the other side who could then take up the...
Yeah. So we just disentangled a whale, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, where that was the situation. For this case, for Starry Night, both times, we were not allowed to cross the border. So there is a counterpart that's the Department of Fisheries Oceans, DFO in Canada, that a gentleman, Paul Cottrell, that works there, does the disentanglements for BC. And so we are, or NOAA is in our stranding coordinator is in communications with him so that we let them know whenever a whale is headed towards the border, and they're supposed to do the same. So they'll give us a heads up if the whale is coming to the US border. In these two cases, we were not allowed to cross into Canadian water. And so as we were approaching it, our NOAA folks were calling to let them know that we were approaching, we were close, but we didn't have permission to continue. So we would have literally had to take everything off, let the whale swim into Canadian waters, and then they would have had to start surf from scratch and work on. After the first response, we brought that up as a concern. And so folks in NOAA's headquarters in DC over the past few months have been working with Canada to come up with an agreement. And so for this last case, we did a whale called Eugenia. Luckily, all the paperwork had gone through. And so we got permission the morning of that we could cross into Canada and complete our disentanglement in Canadian waters. So that was a huge success for us, and I think a huge success for US and Canadian colleagues. But it did mean that we had to travel with our passports, so we had to give them all the information as to who was part of our crew. The DFO from Canada met us on scene, made sure that we didn't, go to land and things like that. At that point, their lead responder was away, and so that whale could have theoretically traveled to Hawaii entangled. And so there was that emphasis of, we really need to get this done now. And so they allowed us to get it done. Next time this happens, hopefully the paper will be in, we showed success. And so we're hoping next time we'll also have permission to work over the border if necessary.
There is whaling allowed by certain traditional groups in North America, I believe, and I don't know whether they do some over in Japan. How does that affect this, and how much of that is happens?
I am not as up to date on whaling, so I would recommend going to the IWC, which is the International Whaling Commission, and they do have information. Last time I checked, it was Japan, Iceland, and Greenland were the three countries that whaled in just like industrial whaling, not indigenous whaling. But I don't believe there's whaling, I think, in Alaska, as well as other places in the Arctic, that is still allowed. Our whales don't travel that far, and so it doesn't affect our populations. But there are probably other folks that would have a better answer for you on that one. But for our little world, it doesn't affect. That's not a concern for us. And yeah.
Got reporting of. I'm assuming that sometimes entanglement can take up to days. What's like the longest effort that you've been in, or that you've heard of?
Oh, yeah. So with those telemetry buoys, they can stay on for a couple weeks. We have different, like they can, if we just left them on, they can stay on for months. But we also have zinc clips to make sure that the zinc will dissolve after like a week or so. If it's something that the animal is going so far offshore, or it started to Hawaii, it's sort of a fallback, or if it's in Hawaii and starting its migration. I've never been in a situation that's had to use those, but we have had cases just earlier this year in California where, a whale had a telemetry buoy on it for about a week or so. And that was just, there was such bad weather that a team couldn't get out to it. So it was basically watching the whale and just waiting for Mother Nature to give us a break to be able to finish the response. Most of the time, if it's early morning, we can get the job done in one day. But it is, we don't work at night, and we need to make sure that the team can safely get back to shore. So we can put on that telemetry buoy to make sure that we're not doing anything in haste or making bad decisions, and that we can go out there the next day and make sure we're doing it properly. So those telemetry buoys are great for that. And so and we have had cases without a telemetry buoy, but that it's been that case that we had a telemetry buoy on a week. It was seen the prior fall once, and actually made the migration and came back, got entangled in something else as well. And so we were able to disentangle it. But there are chances, or there are times that we actually can't get a hold of the whale the first time around. And so there will be, gaps between sightings like that.
Whales that are entangled and they get beached, or is that like another group? Once a whale's beached, they handle it.
So are you talking about the Oregon whale? So we were involved in that one. It's uncommon for an entangled whale, or for all the entangled whales that were reported. This is all on water, not any up on the beach. So that case is quite rare, that it was entangled, came ashore entangled. A lot of times they'll be dead by the time they reach the beach. But I am not involved I am not permitted to touch a whale on the beach. Let's put it that way. So different folks have different permits and authorizations through NOAA. So I'm only allowed to work with large whales. I can't go out there and disentangle a dolphin. That is someone else who is a dolphin specialist that will entangle. And so you sort of get these authorizations, and they want to make sure that you're good at what you do, and you're not like being like, oh, I think I can handle this type thing. So that is out of my purview. But we did have folks down there trying to help refloat it. Yeah, most of the time it's just whales in the ocean. Yeah. Oh, favorite. So I have to say, especially on the East Coast, it's sort of like here in the Salish Sea. Unfortunately, I work up and down the entire coast, so I don't get to see the same whale more than once a year usually. In my previous work, I watched them as calves to grow up. And so that is quite, I think that's my only time that I'm, thankful for what I do, is when it's been a calf that I've disentangled, and to watch it come back with its first calf, or like a mom that you're like, I don't know. I can name them all, but like a big female that you ended up saving, and then you see it with a calf and things like that. And so that's when you're like, oh, I've made a difference, or like I got to watch this whale that I helped save, like actually come back with its own calf. And so those I would say are a lot of the other time it's just frustrations of like, stay still, like, let me help you. But yeah.
Do you have a particular whale species that you are particularly fascinated with?
I have to say my favorites are humpbacks. I think they are magnificent in the fact that they are very flexible. Everywhere you go, they do something different. So they each have different feeding behaviors. Even the individual will have preferences. You'll see those bubble clouds or bubble nets that are popular up in Alaska. On the East Coast, they use different feeding methods, and they'll have it's called kick feeding, but they'll hit the surface of the water various times, and from a mile away it can be like, oh, that's Etch-a-Sketch, because of the way that she feeds. And so it's really fascinating to me that for a species that we tend to clump all into one, like not only on a population level do they vary so much, but even on an individualistic level, they have their own preferences and ways they prefer to feed or things like that. Any other questions? All right.